I would still see the way that we would have a way of have the data, have the information, have the knowledge. And at the same time, I don't believe in the digital infrastructure without the civic engagement.
Are you interested in the proactive nature of smart cities? What do you think about the need for infrastructure to create adaptability? How can we utilize public-private academic partnerships for better urban futures? Stay tuned for answers from Mina Sartipi.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. Today, I will interview Dr. Mina Sartipi, founding director of the Center for Urban Informatics and Progress, and Guerry Professor at the University of Tennessee Chattanooga. We will talk about her vision for the future of cities, technology, electric and autonomous vehicles, smart cities, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Dr. Mina Sartipi, founding director of the Center for Urban Informatics and Progress, and Guerry Professor at the University of Tennessee Chattanooga, leads smart city research, including the testbed, a downtown traffic data project with Chattanooga. Recently named head of the UTC's new research institute, she focuses on transportation, energy, health, and social science. A Bredesen Center faculty member, she mentors minorities and advises girls in computer science. Her research includes cyber-physical systems and big data analytics. She presented at the Chattanooga Connect 2024, advancing urban mobility discussions in a city known for pioneering gig internet and quantum networks. And with that, Mina, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate your appearance in the podcast. And let's jump right in. What does the future of cities mean to you?
We are expecting by 2050, more than 2/3 of population live in urban cities, which obviously this brings up a lot of challenges, but also opportunity. I think the fact that we are living in the era of technology, digital infrastructure and such, provides us a lot of opportunities to really ensure the future of cities that more than 2/3 of population will be living in them are really resilient, they are efficient, and they are inclusive. So when I look at the future of the cities, I'll see that how can we really leverage data, technology, and policy to create these environments, to create these urban environments that are sustainable, that they are adaptive, and they are really responsive to the needs of the citizen. So I think what really is important is while we are going to be leveraging data, technology, and such, but is it really what we are trying to use these for the goal of improving quality of the life for the citizens, but making sure that it's all citizens. And then through these processes, how are we really looking to address these challenges? When we have so many people living in urban environment, we are going to be dealing with congestion. We are going to be living with resources that we have like competing different needs. So how are we going to be managing them? Climate change is happening, it's a real thing. Like, how are we going to be addressing all of these? Again, to go back to ensure that we have an environment that is livable, that it is healthy, that it is accessible for all of the citizens of our urban environment.
Before we move on to the specific terms you discussed, I would love to understand, what do you mean by the city? Because you were talking about how the city is getting more and more inhabited, and how we're using technology. It needs to be resilient, efficient, inclusive, adaptive. But what does the city mean to you?
City means to me like when we have a larger group of people that are living really close to each other. They are interacting with each other. For example, from the transportation perspective, we are having roads that all of us need to be using it to get from point A to point B. Versus I will have it in a way of a city versus rural area. That it's a larger environment, but if you look at the ratio of the population to the area of the living, it's much larger in a city environment. So we have a larger group of people that are living in an area that are sharing resources and they're interacting with each other on a regular basis, on a daily basis.
What is the limit? What size is the city limit for you?
I come from a background that I actually was born and raised in a city that has 16 million people. I was born and raised in Tehran, Iran. And then I came to Atlanta, a city of 1.6 million citizens. And then now I live in Chattanooga. Every time, almost an order of magnitude, the population was reduced. So I'm very familiar with living in a very congested city to a city that I live now is more of a mid-sized city. So I think they are all having the definition of the city, but it's like a larger city to a mid-sized city. I won't define necessarily a city versus what is the population or what is the ratio, but it's an environment versus a rural area that you don't necessarily interact with the people around you. But in a city, that interaction exists. It might be like a congested or less congested environment, but it still is a lot of interaction. There's a lot more dealing with the limited resources that we have.
So the city much more defined by the interactions and the resource use for you than the size itself.
It would be different size of the city. So they're all cities, but it would be different size of the city. Yeah. Chattanooga is a mid-sized city. It's still a city, yes.
Thank you very much for the clarification, because it's just very interesting to understand how the different interviews understand the city. Now, coming back to your original answer to the future of cities, let's go step by step. You mentioned technology. What does technology mean to you?
So I come from a PhD in electrical engineering, and I'm a faculty of computer science department. So technology to me really means a way of observing our environment, whatever that is enabling us to observe our environment. It is the hardware part. It's actually the sensor and the Internet of the things that is providing that observability. But also it's the data that goes back to the software too. So the data that we get from these sensors, like how do we get insight from that? So to me, technology would come from the fact that we actually would be able to observe the environment, to understand what's going on and understand where are the areas that are bottlenecks, where are the areas that we can improve, and where are the areas that are actually working. And that is what the technology can be helping us with the future of cities.
Can we imagine the future of cities without digital technology?
My honest answer, no. Can we see a future of cities with technology? Of course we can. People live off-grid. So yes, it can be. But the way, if we are thinking of the population in the world living in cities, if we don't leverage the technology, it's not going to be a very efficient or a very fun life.
I'm also asking this because when I talk with people who work with digital technology, they usually focus on the digital part, while in other conversations, for example, Howard Bloom in episode 328 described technology as any knowledge we use to improve our life. He brought in writing as a technology. And then I had another conversation with Tom Sanchez, also a professor in the States, and we were discussing how language is a technology which improved the quality of life of people. So I'm curious whether you think about technology outside of the digital realm, which improves, involves, I don't know, the future of cities.
I would still see the way that we would have a way of have the data, have the information, have the knowledge. And at the same time, I don't believe in the digital infrastructure without the civic engagement. So I think that's the part that I don't think the technology, in a way that I define it, has to dictate the future or has to dictate what we can do or not. But it is an enabler. I believe in technology as really making our environment observable. I think that's what I see the technology as. But how are we going to make sense out of that? Or how are we going to be improving it? I do believe in civic engagement in that part, or really hearing and understanding where are the challenges and what are the things that we can do to really improve the quality of life versus just collecting data and trying to do whatever we want to do with it.
I really appreciate that you say data shouldn't really dictate the future, because we have seen some predict and provide approaches, for example, in transportation, based on past trends, creating nightmarish scenarios. So I appreciate that foresight from you. I would also like to understand how you differentiate between data, information, and knowledge, because you were mentioning these separately.
As a person that deals with data, if I just look at it from that perspective, data is just a number or just a bunch of text, right? That is what the raw data is. It's noisy. It has a lot of bias in it, potentially. It has a lot of inaccuracy, but that's just what data is. And data by itself is not useful till we get the insight out of it, to really go from the data to the knowledge. And then that is where we need the human touch, the civic engagement part to really make sense out of it, in a sense that I would say that I work, in addition to transportation, I work in health domain quite a bit. I used to do it more than I do now. And I was always saying, I don't mean it to be a cold person, but a lot of times the numbers I was saying was just a number to me. But this is somebody's blood pressure. This is somebody's days of stay at hospital and such. So there is something about the data, and that is where is also important, in addition to civic engagement, get the engagement of the domain expert. And I think that's where the work that a lot of people in the area of smart city are doing is really breaking the silos and working together, so that the number that you're seeing is not just a number, it has a meaning. And it has a very serious meaning. And how can this number actually be used for an objective that it exists there? And I think that is where the domain expert can help the person that is doing as a data scientist to really understand that and make sense out of that data and translate it to knowledge, which that can be used by a larger population now. It will come out of just AI experts and machine learning experts, data scientists, whatever you want to call it. But it would become a way that a larger population can actually benefit from that.
I'm glad we discussed this, because you were talking about civic engagement when you described technology, and now you brought in the experts. And as an architect, there have been challenges doing community engagement and how the community sees the experts and how the experts see the community. And that's a whole another problematic bag, let's put it that way. I'm curious, what do you say civic engagement is with this additional knowledge of the experts are there to help the whole process?
And that is where even the civic engagement part needs the domain experts to bring the people on board. I learned it very early on that if you go to meetings, that your goal is to have focus groups, to do interviews, to understand the people that are using the roads on a daily basis. What do they see as a challenge? And just listening to them versus going with some question. Do you want me to add this stop sign here versus what are the challenges? And they, with their help, come up with a plan for it. One of the things is, if you are talking about these challenges, you do want the domain expert, the citizens, the community, they all start being at the table at the same time. So it's not really an add-on at the end that, okay, let's just get their input. No, I think the input should come from the beginning. And also the input should come also from the domain expert. Because on a lot of times you would see that we all go with the same objective, the same goal, like, for example, making our environment safer, right? That's a goal for everyone. No one is going to come and says, no, I don't want safety on the roads. But it's really come down to see that, okay, so what do we define as safety, each of us, and what do we see that potentially can get us there? Hearing the community's concerns, community's challenges, and then the domain experts work with them on that. So I think that is also in part that if everybody's at the table from the beginning, they would see the value and they would see that it was not just an add-on, like potentially for some examples, that's just, okay, checking that box. You did bring this up that, yes, there are cases that potentially one side or the other side might not see the benefit of that. But I think that's the goal. That would be the part that we really need to be telling that in simple words and using the right vocabulary for that. And maybe that would be where you were talking about the language, because a lot of times we talk a different language with the technology word, that it may be something that scares people. And I can give you an example of, in one of my interviews very early on, I used the word tracking. And tracking in my world has a very different meaning than a tracking that I'm tracking somebody. That was not the thing. Tracking in computer science and computer vision is very different. It's a technical term, actually. Those are all the education part also that we need to be educating the community, the domain expert. And that is important from all sides to make sure that we do use the common language that everybody agrees on, even for words like tracking that seems to be a very simple word.
will bash on my own profession because in the last 150 years, architects, urban planners, and engineers were just presenting the plan to the community that this is what you get, be happy with it, without any necessary engagement or feedback. And we haven't taught the community to engage with that, give us feedback, invite them from the beginning. I appreciate that you say it needs to be a collaboration between the experts and the community. I would love to go back to another term you used at the beginning, resilience. What does resilience mean to you?
Its simple word is when things doesn't go as planned, when we have a natural disaster, when something goes wrong, how do we get back on our feet, basically? And how we do that very efficiently and effectively. That would be like a case that are we resilient or not? And that is what we see it more and more with everything going on, including climate change, that how resiliency is important for the cities.
Is it enough to get back on our feet?
What do you think?
When I talk about, and I will bring in other terms just to make sure confusing everyone, I think about a spectrum. One end is sustainability, where for me, sustainability describes a system which is fragile, which breaks on shocks. We need to protect that system. That's why it's called sustainability, sustaining that system. In the middle, there is resilience. And resilient systems are able to bounce back to the original level. While at the other end of the spectrum, for me, there is anti-fragility. The anti-fragile system is able to not just bounce back, but become better for the shocks, learn from the shocks. And I believe that we need to create systems, cities, communities, which are not just bouncing back to the original level. And to be honest, I don't think that it's really beneficial to talk about sustainability, but creating systems and communities and cities which are able to become better for the shocks they experience. So that's why I'm asking, is resilience enough? Is coming back to our feet enough?
We do need to get back on our feet. We need to come back to where we started and also learn from that, right? We do need to learn from what happened. And again, if it's a natural disaster, you don't have any control over the source. Having said that, you do have a control, or you can learn from the impact of that. And then planning on, if that happens again, how are we going to addressing it? It's the same thing that you hear from a lot of cities, that cities are growing and we don't have a control. We can't stop it. You don't want to stop it, in fact. And then we see the impact of it. It has a positive impact and it has negative impact. And in the cases of it, we want to understand that, okay, so if the city grow and then the congestion and the traffic is this bad, what are the things we can learn, because we're not stopping that? Then in 5 years, we're not coming back and says, okay, I wish we were 5 years ago and we didn't have that. So yes, to your point, there are cases that we do need to be learning from what happened and what are the things that it potentially broke the system, and trying to make the system more resilient to those or to improve that.
I would also love to understand why you haven't mentioned sustainability. We haven't talking too long that it would be very obvious that you haven't mentioned sustainability, but you have been talking about resilience, climate change, etc., which usually brings in the term sustainability. So I'm curious why you haven't mentioned it.
I think I would have probably bring it up for some other questions, but I never actually draw the spectrum the way you draw it from the sustainable to resilience in interfragile. But I do believe more in the resiliency versus sustainability just by itself. And because I feel like there are things that if you have a resilient system, actually, I do not believe in that. Resiliency does not necessarily mean it's sustainable. What do you think about it?
As I mentioned, I have my own spectrum, so I'm much more interested in the anti-fragile thinking.
Yes.
And to be honest, there have been very interesting, amazing question mark examples and research papers. So I have been talking with Christchurch, for example, and Christchurch had their big earthquakes in 2010 and 2011. And it will be a completely opposing example of what I have been talking about with resilient sustainability, because they were resilient enough to bounce back from the first earthquake in 2010 and saying, okay, we are fixing everything and we are just continuing with our life as we were before the first earthquake. And then in 2011, they had the second earthquake. And they realized that just going back to the same wasn't enough. And they are talking about that's the long-term sustainability, that they wanted to create a long-term sustainable system instead of just bouncing back to the original one. Again, it's an opposing terminology, what I am using, but I think that they have been very anti-fragile because they have been learning from the shocks and becoming better for them. That's an example which compares the two, sustainability and resilience. Again, I think that they are talking about adaptability and anti-fragility instead of sustainability, but they compared the two on two different timescales. You have been talking about some challenges. What are the three biggest fears or concerns regarding the future of cities for you?
I think privacy would be number one. I addressed it from the data side. I approached this from a data side. And that was one of the things that we hear more than anything else is the privacy. And one of the things is also the privacy versus security. And also how are there the cases that you're trying to make your environment safer, but is there going to be more of a cyber risk? So there's a lot of things about the data from security side and then from the privacy. We are looking for data-driven solutions. You are collecting data and what are the ways that you're doing to secure it, but also respect citizens' privacy, because now we are actually talking about real deployment, real world data collection, and then making decisions based on that. So I think that is one of the major, not necessarily a fear, but like one of the concerns that similar to the civic engagement needs to be considered from beginning, so that we'll not be dealing with cases that then we would hear a pushback from the community on those. The other one, which we talked quite a bit about, is infrastructure resiliency. The U.S., like many other cities and potentially some other cities, are facing a lot of aging infrastructure, and that has a serious threat to the city infrastructure. We are seeing it, bridges collapsing, roads having sinkholes, and such. So that's another thing that the cities of the future would be facing. And finally, one of the things that maybe more in terms of solutions that we propose is making sure that it is really equitable and accessible for everyone, because we should not be making the digital divide worsen than what it is now. Because that's a lot of times the solutions should not be only for specific neighborhoods, specific vehicles, specific areas. It should be really something that we need to be thinking about, that how can this be generalized and it can be actually provide opportunities for everyone.
When I talk with people, when they bring in equity, equitable solutions, equal solutions, equality, I always ask them, what does equity mean to them? I'm curious, how do you define the term?
Famous equity versus equality. Basically, making sure that the resources are really accessible. I think that's where I would be talking about equitable access. The technology is like really everyone can access it. And maybe I can just use one example of this is what others in the city of Chattanooga had done, that when pandemic happened and everything went online, we were making the assumption that everyone have access to internet, which is not the case, for almost everywhere. And that is where the city, several leaders of the city and private public partners came together and provided an opportunity there. And that is what I would say, that's equitable access to the technology. That this is not that we are making an assumption or providing opportunity for some part of the population versus others. I would say the same, looking through the same lens for specific examples that we use in transportation. This would be still applied there, because we don't want these solutions only work for the newest vehicles out there. That cannot be the only way of solving the problem, or people being able to pay their way to get somewhere faster than others. Those are the things that we actually, when we think about the future of the cities and how we are leveraging these technologies, we do need to really be thinking about them.
Thank you very much for describing this. Again, I haven't heard anyone describing equity as resources are accessible for everyone. So I'm glad we took the time to describe that. You have been talking about technology. Now you brought in privacy and security regarding data and infrastructure resilience. All of these terms are or can be very connected to smart cities, which you also mentioned. What does smart city mean to you?
Smart city to me really is how can we, I think it's just basically how I actually define the future of city, and maybe and not everyone see it as a smart city. To me is really how can we leverage technology, any ways that we can really understand our environment, to understand what is going on, where are the challenges, how can we leverage the technology and the data to improve it. There are really cases that a lot of times when we look at cities, we're very reactive. We see an area that it's a lot of accidents are happening. Then we go back, like potentially many times actually when it's a fatal accident, we go back and see what did go wrong, let's fix it. But a smart city should not allow that to happen. Smart city should be proactive, that before anything happens would be identify areas that these areas need more attention. In US, you have access to, and I'm just giving you examples to make it maybe more clear. 911, if there is a crash on the road, when you make a call, they have a record of that. That's an open source data. Anyone can have access to it. You did not put a sensor up there. You did not have anything special. Everywhere has this data. There's so much we can learn from that. There are areas that you can really look into it and see that these are the areas that has a very alerting number of accidents happening, and why is it happening? Even at that level of not even technology, the data that already exists, because this is just a purely phone call, right? But there are many other cases that you can be really learning and looking at the trends, looking at the traffic flow, looking at a lot of different things and understanding it before something happens and being proactive. So to me, smart city is that. Smart city is a city that try to avoid anything bad happening. Or if something happens, again, a natural disaster happens, how this smart city would be able to help citizens, how it would help with evacuation plans. Basically provide smart solutions to everyone to be able to either completely avoid a negative outcome or minimize it to the best it can be possibly.
What you have been describing is a continuously evolving, basically a continuum of learning. In my PhD, that was one of the biggest critique of smart cities, that smart cities seems to be a finite term, describing a destination instead of a conscious, continuous urban evolution.
I think you're right. When we talk about using a smart city to become resilient or anti-fragile that you mentioned, we are defining it to make it continuously evolving. And I think that is exactly what we're trying to do there with the data. One of the things that I'm going to add another term here, digital twin. The digital twin, the way you define it, and every person on the planet probably define it differently. How do you define this digital twin that it addresses the current need, it can predict multiple events, and then for each of them, how can you address that? And if something happened, how can it adjust in real time, again, to help with the scenario that had already happened and adjust with that, adapt to that situation and really evolve with that, to see that what would be the case after that and how can we mitigate what's going to be after the event that had happened. I agree with that. The word smart city, it doesn't mean that you would stop. Actually, I don't even know how would you stop at that point, right? Because you're continuously learning and you're continuously understanding what are the areas that can be improved, and you continuously improve those things.
I assume that this kind of continuous learning is an opportunity, and digital twins are opportunities. So what are the three biggest opportunities regarding the future of cities for you?
I would start with AI and predictive analytics. When I was talking about smart cities and say we need to be proactive, often when it become even beyond that, it become prescriptive. But we're not there, but that's the whole thing about a lot of work that is going on. So I think AI and predictive or prescriptive analysis would be one of the opportunities that I would see for the future of the city. The other one that I have talked about it is being really community-centric. I think that is really important. That is from being able to deploy these technology and being adopted, and then you really see the impact of it. because if these are the things that top down and community has not been engaged with it, if they don't adopt it, if the technology, these solutions are not being adopted, it doesn't matter. It would be a lot of investment, but we won't see anything really coming out of it. And I think the other one would be resilient urban development that I think we talked about it a little bit, maybe the smart grid, or it can be green building. There are many things that we can talk about it from the urban development as well.
Let's go back to the first opportunity. I would love to understand, how do you differentiate between AI and predictive algorithms?
When you talk about AI, it's artificial intelligence. You're not necessarily predicting anything. You're learning. It's just that you're learning from that data, and it can be used for prediction. Overall goal of AI is not necessarily predicting anything. So I think it can be predictive. It can be descriptive. It can be descriptive, that you can use AI for descriptive analysis. And there's a lot of value in that as well, that there are cases like the case that I talked about, 911. There's a lot that you can just learn using that, describe the data and understand it. And that would be what would be sufficient potentially. But then you can also do predictive, and you can use it for decision making. There are cases that, like we talked about digital twin, or other cases that you can really use it for real time. For example, we do quite a bit of it in the world of transportation for traffic management. That what we have learned from past and what can we predict what's going to happen, and how can we always define an objective. It can be safety, it can be energy efficiency, it can be many different things. And based on that, you will build your model.
I was just curious because in my understanding, current AI models are predicting models. So they are trying to guess the next word, next sentence, the answer to the question. And that's why it was interesting for me that you are differentiating between prediction and AI itself.
Yes, you're right. There is a lot of cases that AI is being used for prediction. But there are also cases like reinforcement learning, that one of the applications that we use quite a bit, like the Mario game, basically. You just really learning from like different steps. The reason I said it, because it's like we're actually working on a project with adaptive traffic controllers. It's not a case that you have data, you have labeled data that you can actually train your model based on the labeled data. So your cases that you actually really just see that, okay, if I do, this is the gain or this is the loss that I will have from that. And based on that, you start learning. So I think those are the cases that it also falls under the AI.
When you described smart city, you described that technology or the solutions we use in a smart city shouldn't allow even small accidents to happen. At the same time, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, when he wrote Anti-Fragile, the book which describes this anti-fragile systems, he always talks about that we need to allow the small shocks to happen, because then we would learn how to handle the big shocks. And without the small shocks, we will become fragile because we don't know how to react. You were also talking about how these systems learn and evolve. And I'm curious, how can we find the balance between allowing the learning while at the same time creating good quality of life and safe environments and everything else?
The reason that I said that is because there are metrics that you can define that this is a high risk. In our case, like one example is we identified an area in one of our campus streets that there were so many cases of accident was about to happen within 2 seconds. We don't have to have the accident, but when you see that, that was the metric we defined. The shock didn't have to happen. Thankfully, we never had the fatal accident there. But we saw that, and we could actually measure the severity of that accident. And if it's within 2 seconds, a person and a cyclist, or a person and a car and a cyclist, or a car and a pedestrian is about to hit with that severity, even without happening, that's an area that you need to pay attention to. So I think that's how I would see the smart city. But you need to define those thresholds, those metrics and thresholds. That's exactly what we did. We showed that this is the heat map of where people are crossing the street. And these are the high-risk areas that we are seeing it. And this is why we think it's a high risk. We worked with the city and the solution was deployed. So I think those are the things that I would say that thankfully, hopefully, smart city can address without that accident.
Oh, yes, I'm completely all for preventing those accidents. What do you think about electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles?
I would say yes and yes. I would say yes to EVs because we do a lot of studies. I can hear probably potential concerns of people. One of the things that we hear is, are they really clean? You're generating emissions somewhere else when you're generating the electricity, but there are studies that has been done there. Having said that, I'm all for it. Also, we need to make sure that the infrastructure is there. That goes back to community engagement. That goes back to making sure that it's being adopted. And to be able to adopt it, infrastructure needs to be there. Also, I think this would be another case of a mindset change that we don't go to the gas station necessarily, but you plug in your car at night. That's not always the case because if you're doing the road trip and such, you still need the infrastructure. So I think EVs, in terms of climate change and the impact that we are having on that, so I definitely say yes to it. And in terms of autonomous, I would say I'm all for connected autonomous vehicle. And that might be a separate day by itself, but because that's the research that we are working on, and I believe in it, because I think there's a lot of challenges, a lot of bad names that autonomous vehicle has received. There are two things. One is it's a work in progress, and there is still a lot of research going on. And we see that autonomous vehicles are being deployed. There are cases that regardless of being autonomous vehicle or a traditional car with a driver, I can see that how connectivity would help with it. And a lot of cases that the accident happened with autonomous vehicle, connectivity would have helped, would have mitigated that. So I think adding the connectivity to the autonomous vehicle, it would make the future of transportation both safer and also more efficient.
I also believe that these two are the future of our transportation. However, it's a question how we can balance creating this kind of future in the infrastructure while also allowing access to everyone. How we can help the long-term vision of the autonomous and electric reconcile with the short-term with accessibility for everyone.
It's the same thing that I'm sure when the vehicles started to happen. And that's the challenge. That's always a challenge with that. And I think that's where we can look into to see that how are the ways that for autonomous vehicles to be affordable, to be more adaptable, like in a larger penetration rate, they need to be more affordable. The same thing with EV. So that is one of the price of the vehicle and how much people can afford is one thing. The other thing is also the infrastructure. There are roads that I'm driving on it and I'm thinking of if it was not a human driver that was actually using more than what I have learned that drive within the lane, I would not be able to drive on that road. And we see that more in some developing countries than in US. So I think those are the things that we need to be seeing that there are, in addition to affordability, the infrastructure also, both for EV and AV, infrastructure also needs to be ready for it. So why we are having the lower penetration of this, there's so much that we can learn from it. For a long time, we are all going to be in it together. It's going to be a mixed fleet of EVs and ICE vehicles or hybrid vehicles. It's going to be a mix of automation. But we're seeing that a lot of vehicles, again, at least in developed countries, we see that higher level of automation is becoming part of the vehicle. And I see that as a way of adapting to this. I remember a colleague was telling me that at first when they got their vehicle, it would turn off all the camera beeping and everything. And now it was like, I can't drive it without having the camera. That is also the adoption of that because we were now used to it and now it's beeping and it's making you upset. But now you're like, okay, now I have appreciation for it because it's a second eye that it had outside of the vehicle for me. So I think that is what we are seeing with the vehicles, adding more level of automation and even, and I'm saying simple, which I know is not simple, staying in the lane, right? Car following, the adaptive cruise control, and more vehicles are having them and more people are adopting it. The goal for all of these things is not just being a shiny thing, right? The goal is like really making streets safer for everyone and more efficient. So that's really the goal. And then these are like the way to enable that. And I think those are the ways that we're seeing it, that these technologies can help. The more these automations we see and we'll see the impact of it.
We rented a electric and somewhat autonomous car, and it was surprising how fast we were saying that it seems much safer, it feels much safer to allow the car drive itself than do the driving on the highway for 400 kilometers than just me doing the, oh my God, I'm bored out of my mind and I'm not paying attention. I should have asked this earlier, I think. But I would love to understand, what do you mean by the term infrastructure? What does it contain?
Actually, we live in a world that we can't say anymore that we have transportation, we have energy, we have health. I think that they're all like really heavily interconnected, which I think it's one of the benefits of what's going on and advanced technologies and everything, that we're not in silos anymore. So in that matter, when I think about infrastructure, it is from the part that I can get my car charged on the road, and then being on the road and interacting with other vehicles, interacting with the traffic controllers, and all of that are part of the infrastructure. All of these things, from getting the car charged, getting car on the road, communicating, all of that would be part of the infrastructure, at least for the transportation. And again, it's not just the roads itself. It involves like smart grid as well, or the power grid to get the car charged and such.
So you don't mean the community engagement part and the experts as part of the infrastructure?
No. Okay, so I think I answered it based on your AV and EV question. No, I think they all are part of the community, is part of the infrastructure. I will see them as the users and adopters of the technology. So with that lens, I do see that as the infrastructure as well.
Thank you very much for the clarification. And thank you for expanding on, not just based on my EV and AV questions. How do you see the different agent groups' role? Because you have been talking about experts, you have been talking about the community, and you are an academic. And I'm curious, how do you see the different groups interacting? And as an academic, what would you like to see from these different groups? But let's start with the government. What do you think is the government's role in establishing the future of cities?
I always say we need a public-private academic partnership to make the future of cities happen. And I can go through each of them. For the public, we do need the government. I'm from academic, I do research, but this is not the research that I'm doing in a lab. It's not something that we just simulated on the computer and we see if it works and we're happy with it. To really see the impact, these technologies need to be deployed. And now it needs to be deployed in the real world. And that is where government comes in. Because government in this case is also engaging them to see that, is this of interest to the cities? Is this something that they see as a value? Then deploying the technology and seeing the impact of it. It's a very important thing to have that relationship, just at the local and obviously state and federal as well. But local government is really important in that. The same thing is with the private sector. There's a lot of things that we don't need. The academic don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of these technologies already exist. There's a lot of investment in the private sector. And this is a meaningful, a real partnership. We can learn quite a bit from each other and agreeing to share what we are finding. And we actually work together on that. So I think that's where also I will see that private sector coming in to work in, because we're talking about the future of cities. We're talking about cities. It's a large scale. You're not looking at a solution that works in one street, one intersection. You are really, to have this impact, it needs to be working in a large scale. And that's usually not the job of academic. That's the time that academic needs to give the solution out to the private sector and let them run with it, because that's just the way that academic is not set up to be doing that. So I think that's where I see the public and private and academic side. We talked about AVs, we talked about EVs, we talked about a lot of different things, AI, the data, sensors and such. There's just also still a lot of research that needs to be done. So I think if there's a meaningful partnership with these three entities, then we can see the real impact.
I am so grateful that you described it as a collaboration, because yes, we need that collaboration across these silos, because we are creating the future of cities together.
Mm-hmm.
Mina, you have been very generous with your time and answers, and I'm so happy that we were able to have this conversation. What is your role in establishing the future of cities?
I will go back to my role as the academic part of that partnership and collaboration. I direct our research institute and the research institute at University of Tennessee Chattanooga. And as part of my role, one of our pillars is future of mobility. Like, how can we make our mobility, and we talk about future mobility, we talk about electrification, automation, and connectivity, and really being able to have solutions that can be deployed at large scale. So I see that as working very closely with the students to come up with these algorithms. Another thing is, these are the workforce of the future. Things are changing. It used to be you needed to have a degree from one department and that was sufficient. That's not sufficient anymore, because you will be working with many different departments and you need to be able to understand that and communicate that. And that's what the future workforce needs. And that is another job for us at the university and academic, to really educating that future of workforce and equip them with what they need to be able to push the future of the workforce. Because things are going to be very different with the world of AI and digital infrastructure, and also the policy that goes with it. So I think those two would be the role that I would say that we are doing at the Research Institute, both from the research side, working on these problems, coming up with new algorithms and deploying them and testing them and fine-tuning and partnering with public and private sectors, and also working on the workforce.
And please keep up this good work, because it's freaking important to have this collaboration and also prepare the next generation, because we will have so different futures. Mina, thank you so much for your time. Do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
I appreciate that. I thank you for your time, and I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It was really interesting to hear from Mina about the need for the proactive nature of smart city initiatives, not to mention her description of resilience and disaster resilience. Keegan Huckleberry talked about disaster resilience planning in episode 282. You can find out more about Mina online. All the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding Mina's approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this interview? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website, where the transcript and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?